All right, welcome to the live stream. It's Friday here, May 26th, I guess, 2017. Today I'm going to be tying a Rangeley style streamer. This one's called the Rocky Mountain Tadpole. This isn't the fly here. This is actually one of Larry Leet's streamers. This one's called Allie's Special or Allie's Delight. Just kind of had that in place there just to get the camera set up. All right, so I'm going to be tying this on a Gaelic Supreme Mike Martinek Carrie Stevens Rangeley Streamer hook. I'm going to be doing a size 1 8XL. If you need to order some of these hooks, here's the phone number. Get a hold of Graham Maisie and he'll hook you up with some of these. Some of the hooks aren't available anymore. I think these ones might not be available, or the size 2 8XLs might not be available anymore. But last time I talked with him, he was hoping to get some more of these made in the US. The hook maker that used to make them in England retired, so supply dried up. Just before we get to that, I just wanted to show you a couple boxes of older hooks that I had here. And this is an old Mustad and Sons 3907A hook, and I've also got the 3907B. So I just wanted to take a minute and show you the difference between these two. I really like these hooks. They are pretty similar to kind of the holy grail of streamer hooks, which would be the Alcock 8XL hooks. So in the vise, this is the 3907A hook. And it's not a bad hook, but you can see it's got quite a bit of spring in it. And just in comparison, here's the B hook. You can see right away that has quite a bit thicker wire, and I would say this is probably, the B is probably the best hook for a substitute for the antique Alcock hooks. I guess this would be a vintage hook. I don't know what the numberation is on it, but anyways, just to give you an idea, these are fairly hard to get. If you do happen to find some, grab all the ones that you can. So that was a number 2. All right, so anyways, let's get back to the fly here. Just want to give a shout out to Hippie Lomac if you're watching. Thanks for watching. I know you were watching last time. I really appreciate that. If you have any questions, just throw them up in the chat. If you're watching this after the fact, feel free to ask a question and I'll keep an eye on the comments so I can get back to you. All right, so just want to make sure I have everything pretty much. One thing I need is my bucktail. Okay. So this fly I'm tying is the Rocky Mountain Tadpole. It's one that I tied for the Streamers 365 back in 2002, and this was number 298. So a couple things about the hook, about the fly. For the shoulder, I use a Reeves pheasant, but you don't need to use a Reeves. I believe you can use Lady Amherst pheasant. It has some similar feathers for the shoulder, as well as just like a standard ring neck would work. Like the church window feathers would work really well for that. All right, so let's get started. For my presentation flies like this, I usually start off with a flat wax nylon, and I'm going to use white. And part of the reason for that is just so that it doesn't change the color of the floss that goes over top of it. So the thing with these flies is you want to take your time with them. So if you rush them, they tend not to look really great. One other thing I should mention, I'm doing this a little bit out of order, and I'll explain why later. So normally I would start by preparing the wings ahead of time, but I've done some up ahead of time. And when we get to that step in the tying, then I'll show you how I select feathers for the wings and how I put them together. All right, so first we're just going to start by putting on a base layer of thread. So the first aspect of this fly that we're going to add is a tag, and for the tag I'm using some embossed gold tinsel. If you don't have the embossed stuff, you can just use a flat gold tinsel, will work well. So I want to make sure that I keep this body pretty uniform. So I'm going to take off probably about 10 inches of tinsel. And I'm just going to make sure that it doesn't come unspooled. I'm going to tie it in near the head, not right at the head. I want to leave a bit of space there. And I like to tie my materials in along the near side. And next we're going to use some floss. I'm actually using olive uni stretch on this one. I think on the original I used an olive uni floss, or it might have been a Purcell's floss. But again, I'm going to take probably about a foot, maybe a foot and a half to be safe, of material. And I'm going to tie this in alongside as well. And what this does is it just helps keep the body really uniform. Especially if you're tying flies that have more elements, it pays to kind of just take that extra step. All right, so we've got our tinsel and our floss, and we're just going to go ahead and carefully wind this up. And you want to just take a couple turns and then unspool your thread a little bit. If I was tying this to fish, I would be definitely less careful about it. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please just use the chat at the side. This just helps keep the body really smooth underneath. And I usually like to just come to the hook point for my bodies on these streamers. And then I'm going to wind back carefully with close touching turns. I don't want to do a spiral wrap because it'll be quite noticeable on the top layer. So you need a little bit of patience for tying these types of streamers, but they're pretty nice to pass the time with. And if you're interested in tying Carrie Stevens patterns, you can look up her collection. She has quite a number, close to or just over 100 different patterns, perhaps. There's Leslie Hilliard's book, which is wonderful, on Carrie Stevens. There is a library of her patterns in the back. Also, if you have forgotten flies, that's another good resource. Even though it's a little bit on the expensive side, you're probably looking at $250 to $300 to get your own copy. But the images are excellent, and I believe her flies are tied by Marcelo Morales in Forgotten Flies. You can also get the poster, something that I have on my wall, which I use for reference, and it's a nice piece of art for your fly tying room as well. All right, so we've wrapped our thread back to the hook bend and then back to the eye. So I've got a bobbin rest here, and I've just put a half hitch. Make sure you want to make sure it's fairly secure. If you don't have the bobbin rest and you don't have a rotary vise, it makes this a little bit trickier, but can be done. So first we're going to wrap the floss, and then afterwards I'm going to show you how I do the tag and the ribbing all in one. All right, so you want to just make sure that when you're doing your floss, you just want to put some tension and pull all the fibers together before you start wrapping. And you just want to make sure you cover the thread wraps. And you just want to do close touching turns with the floss. And then just reset it every couple wraps. Especially if you're using a regular floss, it tends to, you can see the fibers start to separate as you wrap. So the closer that you hold, the tighter the floss will go onto the hook shank. And if you wrap a little loose like that, just unwrap it, because we're only going to be doing one layer. I've seen some other tires, they'll do a layer of floss all the way down and then another layer back up, which will totally cover it. So again, I'm using stretch floss, which is a little bit different than your standard floss. You can see if I let it go, it's got a little bit of stretch in it, but it tends to lay fairly nice. but it doesn't have much stretch once you pull it taut. And I'm not sure what type of material this is. But it's fairly easy to work with. It's a little bit on the thin side. It would be nice if it was a little thicker. You could get it onto your hook shank a little bit quicker. So when you start getting up to this part of the hook, you can see the hook wants to move around a lot more. So it's just, this is where it really pays to have a thicker hook. So the Mustad 3907 I was showing you at the beginning of the video, just with this much pressure, it would have quite a bit more flex. So whereas this bends just a couple degrees, 10 to 15, the 3907A hook would be bending quite a bit more with the same pressure. Which makes it a little bit tricky doing this step, but the end results of the fly are pretty nice, so you can't really complain too much. All right, we're almost there. All right, and then we're just going to tie that off. You want to be careful with how many wraps you're using on at the head of the fly. All right, we'll just trim that off. All right, so next, I'm just going to add a half hitch just to make sure that doesn't unravel. So let's see, Carrie Stevens, she wraps her flies so that the tinsel goes from left to right, I believe. So when I wrap it, you want to make sure you have the right grain on there. That's the right direction. So the way I wrap this is a little bit backwards from what feels natural. All right, so I'm just going to add a few wraps of this tinsel at the back to make a tag. And this is a metal tinsel, so you have to be a little bit more careful with it. It doesn't have the same kind of stretch that you might be used to with a mylar tinsel. Okay, so we've got our tag, it's a few wraps, and so when I come down under, this is when I start my wraps for the rib. So you can do this with the rotary function on your vise as well. You want to be careful not to pull too hard on your tinsel because you'll pull the embossment right out. And the emboss tinsel adds a little bit more surface area for light to shine off of. All right, so I've wrapped that up to the head. You want to make sure that you hold that tinsel fairly taut because we're going to be wrapping in the opposite direction. So if it's not tight, you'll actually loosen your rib. All right, then we're going to cut that off with the back of our scissors. All right, next we're going to flip this upside down. I'm going to use a little bit of white bucktail. So you don't need a ton, you just need just enough for a little white belly. That's probably lots, and then we're going to thin that down a little bit. So first thing I do, after I've cut it, I'm going to hold it near just above the midpoint. I'm going to pull out any of the shortest fibers. And then next I will pull out any really short ones I can see. Sometimes I just bend it. You can see a few fibers sticking out there, a few hairs. I'll take out any extra long ones. I'll just kind of hand sort those. Now, what I don't want to do is have this hair stack straight, because I don't think it looks very good. Okay. So then I just measure it down to where my tie-in point is. And then what I do is I just wiggle the fibers in my fingers together. You want to kind of get them all slotted into a space so that they're going to sit naturally. So after you tie them in, they're not going to shift too much. And you have a nice belly that lays flat. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So I'll just switch that, and then I'm going to cut that on a bit of an angle. And then we'll just a couple loose wraps. And then as I get towards the head, I'm going to tighten the wrap. And then towards the back, a little bit looser. If you put too much tension on here too soon, these hairs will flare. It's not really something you want. So, and the length of the head on these Stevens Style flies is a little bit bigger than what you're used to. So we're looking at about 6 millimeters, give or take, for that head. And I like these to taper, sort of a triangle. And if it doesn't happen, that's okay, but that's my preference. Okay, so next we're going to tie on a throat. I'm just going to grab a couple feathers here that I'm going to use to put the wing together. So what I'm looking for when I'm doing my wing, this is a Whiting American neck hackle. So typically you're going to choose a feather from each side and they'll complement with the curvature. So just want to make sure you find one that has a nice shape for what you're looking for. Doesn't have too much of a bend or too much of a curve. You see that one goes a little bit up in the end. I might not use that one. Unless I use it for the side, it would be okay. But you want to make sure you take them from different sides because you don't want the wings to go up. All right, let's see what we got here. This cape seems to have quite a bit of curve in it. So if it's been picked over fairly well, I've probably tied 100 or more streamers with this. Here's a nice feather. It's pretty straight. And I'll grab one from the other side. So I usually just give them a quick match, tip to tip. Make sure that I've got enough length on them. Okay, looks good. Then we do the same with the grizzly feathers that we've chosen. So this is going to be our outer wing. All right, so before we do that, I'm going to tie in the throat, and this one calls for a bit of orange hackle fibers. So just turn that up. Followed by a couple of the grizzly hackles, grizzly olive hackles. Not a super heavy dressed throat on this, just more of an accent. And then I'm just going to pull these up, trim. All right, so let's see. Don't believe this one has any peacock on it, but something that's fairly common on a lot of Stevens patterns. So again, I like to use the natural eye. And I would just tie it on like so. Tie that down. Probably make sure that all the fibers are facing the same direction before I commit to it. That would be good. But we're going to omit that on this pattern. Instead, we're going to build our wings first. Okay. So we've selected our feathers. So I'm going to match up the orange ones tip to tip. I'm just going to measure them on the hook. And you just, for proportion, you want it to come a little bit past where the belly ends and a little bit past the hook bend. So that looks not too bad. This might be a touch long. All right, that looks good. So transfer those in my hand, and then I'm just going to take my scissors and poke through just to kind of mark the spot. And then I'll tear away the fibers on the bottom and the top and trim the stems. Okay, so now I have my measurement for the length, and I can measure that against the olive grizzly hackles that I've chosen. So I'll just do one at a time. So again, I just line these up. Tip to tip. And then I just use my scissors, separate that fiber. If you're doing a couple at a time, it's good to use the same feather to measure if you're tying on the same size hook. If you're tying on different sized hooks, you want to measure for each hook And I should mention some guys, some tyers, they will have a guide, so they'll write down on paper how big each wing for a specific hook was. All right, so you can see how that mixes. The orange and the olive gives it a nice kind of, I don't know, like a brown trout or brook trout kind of coloration. All right, so now we're gonna start assembling the wing. And for Carrie Stevens style flies, the wings are glued together. So you want to make sure you have everything laid out the way that you want it to sit on the fly. And these are going to sit on either side of the body a little bit. Looks good. So we'll take one side and we'll glue it together. And to do that, I have some fairly viscous cement, almost booger consistency. And what we do is we're going to take our first feather. What I want to do is I just want to lay a little bead of cement along the stem. Right along that stem. You want to try and keep it off the rest of the feather. See how thick that is? It sits right up top. And I'm going to match the stem to stem. Give them a little squeeze. And I'm going to set that aside and let it dry. I'm going to do the same thing with the other one here. This is a little bit gummier than I usually have it. So if it gets a little too gummy, you can thin it down a little bit. See, it's got a nice little bead of cement there. So this is actually Sally Hansen's Hard as Nails. And I've just let some of the solvent evaporate for a day or two and then put the lid back on it. And then I just try and keep it at the consistency. All right, so I'll set that aside. So next we're gonna put the shoulder together on this fly. So this one, I'm using a Reeves pheasant. So it's got these beautifully black laced feathers. And I'm going to choose a couple of those. And for these, I'm going to do similar measurements. So I'm going to put them tip to tip. And I'll just start by pulling off most of the fluff. So you see, if I use a shoulder that big, it's pretty much half the length of the fly. So it's a little bit long. Probably want it to be about a third. Somewhere around there. So we'll just start by pulling some of those fibers out. That looks pretty good. And this kind of makes like the gill plate of the minnow. Okay. So then last, I'm just going to take a little bit of jungle cock nail. And I usually don't get expensive capes. This is a grade 3 cape, but it's got some nice color in it. So I'm going to take 2 larger nails. Try and find ones without too many splits, but these ones are all split pretty good. And so for the measurement on this, I like to keep the eyes probably, let's see, about here. But might actually put them out a little bit further, just so that it contrasts with the black. Okay, so I'm going to mark that. And then I'm going to take my other jungle cock and I'll measure that as well. And then I'm just going to strip the fibers on each side. You can trim off the stems if you like. It's a little bit easier to work with. So when I attach the jungle cock, I like, and by the way, you can fix this jungle cock if you like, so that it's not split like that, but I'll show you what I do. I'm just using regular strength, hard as nails, and I'm going to put a liberal amount on the back of the feather. Then if you pull it, just give it a second, let that dry. That fixes that split a little bit, not completely. So I'll give that a second to dry on its own, and I'll do the same to the other. Just want to make sure that's fairly saturated. And it's definitely not perfect, but it's better than what it was, I suppose. If you want to get a little bit better, I think we can do that. Just add a little bit more glue to the tip there. It's not so bad. Okay. So now we'll want to attach those to our shoulder. So after these have dried for a couple seconds, I'm going to come back. I'm going to put a nice fresh layer of cement on these. And you can see that adds quite a bit of weight to the feather. Okay, so I'm just going to line that up. Make sure you don't have any glue on your fingers. And just press it gently. And put that aside, let it dry. And we'll do the other one here. And I like to lay them straight down the middle. You see the glue comes through on the back side a little bit, so that should bond them together fairly well. And we're just going to let that dry. So luckily, I've got a couple that I've done up ahead of time here. These ones are a little bit differently marked, as you can see. And let's see. Oh yeah, so one thing I want to do at this point is I'm just going to add a half hitch on our white thread. I'm going to switch over to black thread. So for this one, I'm just using a super fly, super thread. One lays nice and flat. This is a 6/0. And I'll just start that at the head again. Okay. So what I do is I kind of open up the wings, and then I'm going to place them one on either side. Just kind of get them in position. Then we're just going to add a couple light wraps onto this. And you want to look at it from the front. Make sure that everything is straight up and down. Might look a little wonky there. I don't think my angle is quite right. And by the way, Carrie Stevens used to tie these without a vise, so just imagine putting all this together with one less hand to use. All right, so I think that looks pretty good. So I'm just going to give it a couple tighter wraps near the back. And then I'm going to take off these stems at the front one at a time. Wrap a little bit. Just so that I don't have a big step down and have to mask it with a whole bunch of thread. That's not too bad. It's got a little bit of a bump here, so I might actually just unwrap a little bit. Try and fix that before I do too much more. All right, we'll just clean up the head here a little bit. Again, I'm looking for somewhat of a triangular shaped head there. Then we'll add a whip finish to this fly. Just want to make sure it sits properly. As you can see, straight on. All right, looks good. So you can preen this a little bit just to get everything in the right place before you put in a little shadow box or whatever. I like to add 3 or 4 coats of head cement to the finished head. Let that soak in really well. And then coat the top with something somewhat high gloss. So I'll just give that a couple hours to dry. Then I'll put another coat of cement on there. And so I've got the other wings as well, so I'll make up another one sometime soon. Right, there you go. Rocky Mountain Tadpole. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any comments, please leave them in the comment section below, and I'll get back to your inquiries as soon as possible. Thanks so much.